They thought they were hunters. They thought the mountain was just land, just trees, just cold air and long hikes. But the mountain had already chosen them before they ever put up their tents. The animals went silent. The trails twisted back on themselves. Something circled their camp all night without ever showing a face, and by the time they finally understood they were not alone, it was already too late, because whatever was out there wasn't afraid of guns or fire or daylight. And it wanted them to know they were being closed in on. If stories like this unsettle you, subscribe. These are the disasters that don't explode or scream for attention, the ones that happen quietly while the world above keeps moving. New stories every week. It should have been just another night in the mountains, just another trip where tired men sat around a dim fire and laughed too loudly and spoke about ordinary things that would not matter years later. Yet instead it became the night when safety slipped like loose dirt beneath a boot and never came back again. The injustice begins right there, because none of them had done anything to deserve what was waiting for them in the dark, and none of them had any warning that the ground beneath their normal lives had already cracked. They were hunters, but that night they were the ones being hunted, and the worst part was how slowly they realized it. The first sign did not come as a roar or crash or dramatic sound from the trees. It came as something smaller and far more frightening, a feeling that the woods around them had changed shape even though every tree was standing in the same place, a realization that the air itself felt wrong, like the world was holding its breath and waiting for something terrible to happen, but refusing to tell them what it was. One man stopped laughing first. Another stopped eating. Another suddenly noticed how dark it had gotten, darker than it should have been at that hour, as if night had decided to come closer than usual. Somewhere out there something was watching them. They did not see it. They did not understand it. They only felt the weight of being seen, which is somehow worse, because the mind fills the shadows with whatever it fears most, and it does not need details to feel terror growing stronger. Every crack of branches felt deliberate. Every gust of wind sounded like whispering that came from a place with lungs and intention. The fire that should have felt comforting now felt like a small, fragile island, surrounded by a black ocean that was slowly closing, and around its edges, none of them said the words out loud at first. Fear rarely arrives as speech. It arrives as silence. The first thing that disappeared was not a person. It was sound. The forest that should have been alive with insects and wind and distant movement suddenly felt muted and heavy, like everything had stepped back and was waiting for something bigger to take the stage. One man stood up to check the gear they left outside the tent and did not walk far, only a few steps into the darkness. Yet when he stopped moving, the others realized they could not hear him anymore. Not his footsteps, not his breathing, not anything. They called to him and their voices felt too small in the wide dark. He answered, but his answer did not feel right. It sounded thin, strained, as if something had wrapped cold fingers around his throat and squeezed gently just to see what fear tasted like. He said he was fine, said nothing was wrong, said he would be back in a second, yet none of them believed him, because they could hear the tremor he was trying and failing to hide. He came back fast, faster than someone who had found nothing wrong, faster than someone who wanted to pretend everything was ordinary. And when he sat down, again no one asked questions, because no one wanted to hear the answers yet. Then things started moving at the edge of light, just out of sight. Not like deer, not like elk, not like anything they were used to. Whatever was out there did not flee when the fire cracked louder or when voices rose. It stayed. It circled. It measured. It waited. Every instinct in their bodies screamed that they were being sized up from every direction at once, and that what was looking at them was not confused, not curious, not harmless. It was deliberate. They checked rifles, not because they planned to shoot anything for sport anymore, but because they were slowly realizing that tonight would not be about hunting at all. Tonight would be about survival, and survival suddenly did not feel guaranteed the way it always casually does when danger is still theoretical. The darkness kept coming closer. Morning did not make anything better. The light arrived thin and sickly, not in the bright, strong way that normally makes night feel like nothing more than a bad dream. They expected relief when the sun climbed, but instead there was only the realization that what had been out there in the dark had not gone anywhere. Prints appeared in places they did not walk. Branches were broken in paths that did not lead anywhere an animal would choose. Something had circled their camp over and over while they slept in, shifts, and tried not to admit how terrified they were. One man wanted to pack up and leave immediately. Another argued that leaving now would mean admitting that something truly wrong was happening, and humans cling to normalcy even as it dies right in front of them. They argued softly because even in daylight they were afraid of making too much noise, afraid of drawing attention to themselves, afraid of waking whatever had watched them all night if somehow it was still asleep. Then they noticed a smell, not rot, not death the way people imagine it in stories. It was stranger than that, like the earth itself had been opened somewhere nearby and something old had been stirred up and dragged toward the surface. It brought a sting with it, something that made eyes water and skin feel too tight, something that whispered in the deepest part of their brains that they were standing somewhere human bodies were not meant to be. They started walking anyway because staying felt worse. The trees seemed to lean in. Trails they thought they knew twisted in ways they did not remember. Compass readings did not make sense. Landmarks they had used for years appeared to have shifted when they looked at them from new angles. They kept circling back toward the same place no matter how they tried to leave it, as if the mountain itself was folding roads back onto them with patient cruelty. Their footsteps grew louder while the world around them grew quieter. The injustice of it settled in slowly but heavily. They were experienced. They were prepared. They had done nothing reckless or foolish, yet none of their skill mattered now because something larger had entered the story and rewritten the rules of it without asking their permission. The mountain was not letting them go. It is one thing to feel afraid. It is another thing to feel that fear reach out and touch you. By the time night came again, every man could feel it pressing against his skin like cold hands. Not physically, not in a way that leaves bruises, but in a way that leaves marks on the inside where no one else can see them. Every sound became important. Every shadow became a possible door to something they could not name. The fire did not comfort them anymore. It only showed them how wide the darkness beyond it truly was. They began to hear movement that matched their breathing. When one of them inhaled sharply, something out in the trees seemed to inhale with him, just a fraction too late, like an echo made of flesh instead of stone. When someone shifted position, something shifted back. They stopped speaking without meaning to, because the sound of their own voices felt fragile, as if speaking too loudly would break whatever thin barrier still existed between them and whatever waited just past the edge of sight. Sleep became impossible. Closing eyes meant surrendering control, and control was already slipping through their fingers faster than they could close their hands. They sat awake and watched the darkness, and the darkness watched back, and in that long, slow staring match they began to understand that they were no longer guests on that mountain. They were prey. One man finally broke and tried to leave camp alone, not out of bravery, but out of desperation, convinced that if he could just get away from the others, the thing watching them would choose someone else instead. The selfish thought flashed through his mind, and it terrified him even more, because fear does that. It peels away layers of who people imagine they are and shows them the raw survival underneath. He took 3 steps toward the trees before he stopped, not because anyone called him back, but because every part of his body screamed not to take the 4th. He returned to the circle of firelight with shaking hands and did not explain himself. No one asked. The night stretched on and the pressure kept building, not in sudden jumps but in slow suffocation, the way deep water presses down on a diver's chest until breathing becomes a memory rather than a promise. They did not know what waited out there. They did not know what it wanted. They only knew that the mountain had decided something about them that they had not yet understood, and the feeling grew stronger every minute. Something was getting closer. The first thing that disappeared was not a person. It was sound. The forest that should have been alive with insects and wind and distant movement suddenly felt muted and heavy, like everything had stepped back and was waiting for something bigger to take the stage. One man stood up to check the gear they left outside the tent and did not walk far, only a few steps into the darkness. Yet when he stopped moving, the others realized they could not hear him anymore. Not his footsteps, not his breathing, not anything. They called to him and their voices felt too small in the wide dark. He answered, but his answer did not feel right. It sounded thin, strained, as if something had wrapped cold fingers around his throat and squeezed gently just to see what fear tasted like. He said he was fine, said nothing was wrong, said he would be back in a second, yet none of them believed him, because they could hear the tremor he was trying and failing to hide. He came back fast, faster than someone who had found nothing wrong. faster than someone who wanted to pretend everything was ordinary. And when he sat down, again no one asked questions, because no one wanted to hear the answers yet. Then things started moving at the edge of light, just out of sight. Not like deer, not like elk, not like anything they were used to. Whatever was out there did not flee when the fire cracked louder or when voices rose. It stayed. It circled. It measured. It waited. Every instinct in their bodies screamed that they were being sized up from every direction at once, and that what was looking at them was not confused, not curious, not harmless. It was deliberate. They checked rifles, not because they planned to shoot anything for sport anymore, but because they were slowly realizing that tonight would not be about hunting at all. Tonight would be about survival, and survival suddenly did not feel guaranteed the way it always casually does when danger is still theoretical. The darkness kept coming closer. There is nothing left to argue about when everyone finally understands that they are not alone and have not been alone since the first night. When everyone realizes that this thing is not wandering, is not curious, is not passing through, but is focused entirely on them with a kind of attention that feels wrong in the deepest parts of themselves. Night comes again, and it feels final in a way night should never feel. The firelight makes their faces look older. Their eyes search the darkness not because they expect to see anything clearly, but because they are afraid not to look. Every crack of a branch makes their hearts pound so hard it hurts. Every gust of wind feels like something brushing past their shoulders, even though nothing is there when they turn to look. They sit closer together without thinking about it, because closeness feels like the only protection left when nothing else makes sense anymore. The mountain has stopped pretending. It wants them to know they are being closed in on. They do not sleep. Sleep belongs to people who believe tomorrow is guaranteed, and that belief has been stripped from them piece by piece until nothing is left but raw awareness. They sit in the dim light and remember every moment that led them here, every sign they ignored, every feeling they pushed aside because it was easier to pretend the world was normal than to accept that something had noticed them and chosen them. The sounds grow closer, not suddenly, not dramatically, but with slow certainty. Leaves move where there is no wind. Stones shift where no one is walking. The circle of darkness around the camp feels like it has a pulse of its own, beating slower than their hearts, but stronger, pushing against the air in waves they can almost feel on their skin. One man tries to speak and his voice cracks, not from dryness, not from cold, but from the weight of knowing that the moment he has been dreading since the first night is finally here. They raise their lights and see nothing. They lower them and sense everything. The fear becomes almost physical now, a pressure behind their ribs, a tightness in their throats, a heaviness in their limbs that makes movement feel strange and difficult, as if the mountain is quietly testing how far they can go before their bodies refuse to continue. No one wants to run. Running would mean turning their backs, and every instinct tells them that turning their backs would be the worst mistake they could ever make. Something steps into the space just beyond sight. They do not see it clearly, only the suggestion of shape where there should be none, only the quiet certainty that whatever the night closes in, and the last piece of courage they still have is the decision to stay together, not out of strategy, not because it guarantees survival, but because fear is easier to face when there is another human being close enough to touch. They reach out, hands brushing hands in the dim light, and that small contact feels more real than anything else left in the world. And then the sound comes from directly behind them. Not loud, not dramatic, just close, close enough that they feel breath move the air, close enough that they know they are out of time. The conclusion is simple and terrible and absolutely clear. They came to the mountain believing they were hunters. The mountain had been waiting to teach them they were not. What happens in the next second decides everything.